Last time I asked a question and then didn't answer it. What happens when the very things that made liberalism win start causing issues to the society holding it? It's still a very good question to ask, but before we get there, we need to tackle an underlying assumption that many people seem to hold about how these tools and models first get applied on society in the first place. Here's the backwards assumption. People think philosophers sit down, write out their philosophy, and then the society chooses to apply that to themselves. And it's basically completely back to front. If we take the example of John Locke, Second Treatise of Government, many take this to be the first kind of starting point for liberalism. But actually, if you look back at English history, England had been getting to that point for hundreds of years before he wrote anything down at all. Magna Carta being an obvious example in 1215, where the laws were defined that the king had to hold to. He couldn't just arbitrarily rule. There were certain laws that even he had to follow. And there are many other cases of this along the way. England had evolved to liberalism by the time John Locke put pen to paper. The philosopher did not define liberalism as then and then have it applied to the country. And here's a stranger point of the same thought. Societies do not need to be logically consistent, which is kind of defeats the entire point of philosophy, right? The whole point of philosophy is to be logically consistent and use rationale and reason and logic to get from one point to another point. Societies don't need to do that. They're not logical systems. Take the example of pride as a moral. If you look to the Aristotle form of morality, let's say Nicomachean Ethics, what Aquinas pulled in to the Western kind of moral framework, pride is the height of virtue. It is the number one moral virtue a person can have. Greatness of character and soul, pride itself. And if we think about the New Testament, pride is the worst of the sins. It's actually what got Satan kicked out of heaven. It is that bad. Now, Aquinas brought these two moral traditions together. They weren't, one didn't beat the other. They were held together. And they held together for maybe 800 years from Aquinas. And they really defined the whole moral code of the Western European world from then on, especially for England. Now, think about this. What do you think should happen if a society holds two morally completely incompatible moral codes here? You know, pride as virtue versus pride as sin. They're not just slightly out of each other, they're completely opposite. What should happen from the philosopher's logic? Decay, stagnation, collapse. What actually happened? 800 years of the most explosive expansion the world has ever seen. We circumnavigated the globe, we industrialized, we built colonies of a quarter of the land's mass on the planet. This is not a society that failed due to contradiction. This is a society that massively succeeded, and not just despite that contradiction, but seemingly completely untroubled by such a major contradiction in its moral values. And this is a major error for Marx, because his entire view of why capitalism collapses into socialism was based on the logical inconsistencies within capitalism, between labor and capital and the conflicts there. But as we've just seen, contradictions in belief systems do not have any impact whatsoever like that. We don't see societal collapse. We don't see one form collapsing into another. What we see is massive success in our own history from something that's diametrically opposite, the pride as virtue versus pride as sin, a massive contradiction, and yet society was enormously successful from it. So Marx needs logical inconsistencies to lead to revolution. He doesn't get to have it. That isn't what happens in a society. It's not an argument, it's a society. And there are further two areas relevant for this discussion from Marxism. One is from Marx himself, and one is from his followers, and they're actually two different errors that they've made. Marx did not design socialism. He just thought it was the inevitable next stage in history. And that's his main error, is thinking that there's a direction to history, that inevitably there's feudalism, inevitably it leads to capitalism, inevitably it leads to socialism. Now, as we've been discussing, that's not how cultural tools work. Some happen to proliferate, some happen not to. Some happen to meet and evolve with a society, some are not the right fit, some are not able to proliferate themselves. And that's all it is. You had waves and waves of these different cultural tools all competing against each other, and what proliferates is what we see. So there's no direction to that. That can be completely at random based on the decisions of millions of people underlying societies. That's where Marx was wrong. His followers did a different error. They assumed they could design the socialist society or the communist society they wanted and basically apply it to an existing country. And we saw what happened there with, say, the Soviet Union. Russia was in no way a society that had evolved to the point where a socialist or communist cultural tool could work or be implemented. They tried it anyway, and look what happened there. Aside from the 70 years of communism, they also had the huge Russian Revolution and the millions of deaths there, let alone all the others that followed. Now, France made a similar error, and I think this is kindly maybe less understood. So France's error was actually with a philosophy that looked like it had proven itself. England had liberalism at the time of the French Revolution, and that's what was inspiring France. Likewise, the American Revolution, inspiring the French. But they couldn't just take liberalism and apply it onto their monarchy society. It just didn't work. They needed 3 different revolutions, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives lost, and decades to make this work. And at the very end, the liberalism they got is not the liberalism they wanted to get at the start. So it's a very challenging and nearly impossible thing to do, is to apply a certain philosophy to a society. This is where 1989 becomes interesting, because that's the year that Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History, basically setting up liberalism as the end state that all human society is pointing towards, as the inevitable final destination where we've solved the problems of how to make human societies work. Liberalism is the answer. Nothing will ever change from there forevermore for human society. Liberalism is it. Now, that is a very bold claim, but many were making it around 89, fall of the wall and so on, around that kind of time period. Fukuyama was a bit more interesting than the average commentator. He was twice State Department policy planning staff. He was on the National Endowment for Democracy, a member of Freedom House, whose figures I was using in the last video. By any account, he has been a key missionary for liberalism, like I mentioned on the past video. So he's a clear liberalism missionary. But what happened next is what's more interesting, because then he became one of the key kind of critics of that point of view. The main issue here is, we can call it Denmark. Think of Denmark. They have very good institutions, rule of law, very little corruption, basically all the hallmarks of a perfectly successful liberalist society, Denmark. And the issue that development economists and others keep running into is they keep trying to take the institutions in Denmark and just apply them straight on a completely different society that has had none of the evolution to get to the point that Denmark had to get there. Denmark has been through centuries of gradual cultural evolution to get to the point where it has these institutions. You can't speed run that in a year or two in a completely separate country, completely different people and time and capabilities and so on. We've seen already it doesn't work with others, but it's still a mistake that keeps being made over and over again across our international society. Liberalism doesn't work for all people, all times, and all places. It may work for now or be the best we found for now, but it's not universally the best everywhere. Think of a town 5000 BC in Mesopotamia, a town of maybe 1,000 people scratching a living from the mud, from wheat and grain and so on. What use do they have for a president, a parliament that pulls labourers off the land to debate? An independent judiciary, again, pulls labourers off the land to hold the government to account. A written constitution, that requires literacy across a broad swathe of the population. It requires people there to enforce it against the president. These are all things that they don't have the resources to support. And also, it's solving a different set of problems to the ones they have. Their problems aren't, how can we manage a million plus person society? Their problems aren't, how can we limit the megalomania, abuse of power of this person? Their problems are, how do we manage a town of 1,000 people, and how do we stop the monarch next door from conquering us? There's a completely different set of problems that liberalism is not there to deal with. Take that conquest example, for example. The the monarch can start marching his army over. How does a liberal town respond to that in that era? Well, they have to convene parliament because the president doesn't have the powers to use the military straight away by himself. So they need to pull the levies off the field to go to their parliament. They then need to debate, because that's the point of the parliament. They then need to assemble the army, and they also need a way to fund it, which is harder for them because they pulled so many people off the land to have the parliament and the judiciary and so on, that they're not creating the same amount of food. And then they just get conquered. So liberalism is not the perfect solution for every society everywhere. Now, monarchy has also been through this assumption of permanence that liberalism has today. It was around for a very long time, thousands of years. It proliferated very well in that period. But also, many in Europe, Western Europe, felt it reflected the way God had structured heaven on earth. So it had a more divine permanence to it. There was the monarch or God at the top. There were his angels or the lords below. And so given the earthly realm reflected the heavenly realm, that felt like a very permanent and right set of ways to run a society. But as we've seen today, monarchy didn't last. And the best thing to kind of show the hubris of this concept is Shelley's poem Ozymandias, which we can read out now. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level strands stretched far away. Monarchy didn't fall because someone designed something better and applied it to a monarchy society. Monarchy fell because the conditions that made it the best solution at that time for those people and places, or the best proliferator at that time, stopped holding, and something else came along to take its place. Monarchy's fall is not the exception, it's more the rule. These cultural tools are never permanent. They rise and fall as the people and the societies and the rival states and so on around them change. Things that proliferate better survive. And they're not static cultural tools either. They themselves mutate. The liberalism of 1700 is completely different to the liberalism today, for example, as a clear example. But what do they mutate to do? Now, you may think they mutate to be better, to help humans more, to better build societies. But actually, it's not quite that they mutate to. Because mutation is not just how they're changing, but it's also what's surviving of what's changed. And what survives for the cultural tools is what proliferates. So ultimately, what cultural tools that survive have mutated for is proliferation, for survival. They haven't mutated to better support societies. Now, that doesn't mean whilst they've done that to proliferate, they've also better supported the societies, but it also doesn't mean that that the only thing they've done is support their societies better. And in the next chapter, we really tackle the key message here is what happens when liberalism is applied to society that is actually a very good fit for it, say Great Britain, and then suddenly it mutates to something that is less good for the host society. If this is the kind of content you like more of, then please like and subscribe, and watch out for the next one.